Welcome to Live Boldly Ministries podcast. I'm your host, Nicki Corinne White, and today we're going to be talking with Gabrielle Boliou. She is the Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for Twin Falls County in Idaho. She's got a passion for learning about and helping with human trafficking, and having met her on several occasions and talked things over with her about this, I just really realized how many misconceptions I have and the things that I needed to learn to help with this growing problem in our country. And so I really wanted to have her on the show. And, I tell you, this girl, she's amazing. She's 26 years old, and she has accomplished more in her short life than most people do in their entire life. She's very purposeful in the things that she does, and I just love the things that she's doing. So Gabrielle, let's start with what gave you the passion. I know that you did your thesis paper when you were in college on human trafficking, and there was so many details you learned in stats. And how did you choose that as your thesis, and what would be some stats you could give us so we understand it better?
Yes. So essentially, I've been passionate about fighting human trafficking really since high school. When I first realized I wanted to be an attorney, I was thinking about how I can do that for God's glory and not just to build my own little kingdom. Like a lot of lawyers, I think, stumble into that trap. And so a friend directed me to the problem of human trafficking. They need attorneys in all different ways fighting that battle. And so I figured during college and also my master's degree that I would just research everything I could about this problem. For my thesis, there's a lot of research already on push and pull factors that make victims of trafficking vulnerable to manipulation and abuse and exploitation. And so that ground has already been pretty thoroughly explored. But what hadn't really been explored was the trafficker's perspective. And I thought if we can understand what causes them to see one location or one country as more appealing for their trafficking than others, then surely we should be able to combat those appealing factors. And so that was what my thesis was on, was explaining international human trafficking in terms of factors that appeal to traffickers. And what I found is that the main factors that make a country appealing to traffickers is not money, like most people expected. Like most people thought that traffickers brought people purely from poorer countries to richer countries, but it's a lot more complicated than that. The other factors that traffickers are really looking for is they're looking for legalized sex work, specifically brothels. I think because that creates a facade or an appearance of professionalism that makes the traffickers attract buyers who will pay more money. They also look for drug routes because human traffickers often either are drug traffickers or kind of work with them and use the same corruption routes. And then the other factor that was significant in my research is police corruption, which is difficult to measure, but certainly the way that police officers think about and view sex workers and prostitutes influences a police officer's ability to help and to even identify victims of trafficking. And so any place where you have a lot of police corruption or just police misunderstanding of the problem, then traffickers are going to be able to do a lot of their work there.
Wow. You always think that police would be helping with this, so it's hard to see that police corruption would add to that. Can you give us an overview of some of the common misconceptions about human trafficking and what you wish that people would understand? And I know we've kind of talked about that a little thing, the gorilla and the Romeo type of thing. Could you share with us some of that?
Yes, that is a key misconception that it impacts every area of trying to fight this problem. It impacts for one thing, the victims who sometimes won't recognize themselves even as victims because they have this misconception of what trafficking looks like. It impacts the people who are trying to help, who sometimes make things worse because they have this misconception. And it even impacts laws that get written that really aren't very helpful. And so what you just mentioned is two different kinds of pimps that are referred to by these terms in the trafficking world. You have guerrilla pimps on the one hand, Romeo pimps on the other. And the misconception that's very prevalent in the United States is that trafficking is perpetuated by primarily physical violence and threats. This would look like a guerrilla pimp who uses strength, violence, forcibly kidnapping people and locking them somewhere in order to facilitate trafficking. It makes trafficking look very much like kidnapping. But trafficking is much more analogous to domestic violence. If you've ever known someone, or perhaps yourself been in a situation where you're in some kind of relationship that's unhealthy and it's harmful to you, but you don't see it that way, you see it as life-giving and life-saving. You see it as someone that you're dependent on, even when they're hurting you. That's what human trafficking is like. And the Romeo pimps are very good at that. They use emotional manipulation. They use myriad psychological tactics to build this dependence on them from their victims, so that their victims don't see themselves as victims and don't want to get away. And obviously that has some big impacts on how we address this problem, because if all we're trying to do is rescue people from someone whom they fear and they hate, the way that you would rescue a kidnapping victim, that's actually quite simple. But instead, trying to rescue someone from someone who is hurting them, but they don't even realize it, they think they love them, they think that this is their boyfriend, that's a lot more complicated and needs to be done much more carefully. And so that misconception, I think, is huge and really needs to be addressed more in this country and across the world, really.
Yeah, for sure. I wouldn't have thought of that until you had told me about that. And it's like, wow, that changes a lot in, how you view it. When you were in law school in Las Vegas, by the way, Gabby is in my book, Bold, with her testimony about some things that she shares about when she's in law school, walking the strip and talking to some victims of human trafficking. What were some things while you were in law school that gave you a deeper understanding into what some of the mindset is of some of the victims?
Yes. So I went to law school in Las Vegas and had so many opportunities to work with organizations there that are really trying to do trauma-informed research and care for trafficking victims. And one of the things that I did that you just mentioned is at 3 a.m, we would drive down to downtown Las Vegas, and we would find the streets where the sex workers, both the ones who are definitely being trafficked and the ones who may be doing it sort of their own volition, although I think that's also a lot more complicated than it appears on the surface. But we would walk down these streets and try to talk to them. We'd have care packages to hand out. We would ask if we could pray for them. And the goal really was just to start fostering trust between them and us, because they're very used to squares, as we're called, looking at them with judgment and suspicion, looking and saying, wow, why are you wearing that? What are you doing? And so instead we would say, hey, we care about you. Here's a water bottle. And eventually they would start to recognize us. We'd recognize them. We could ask more personal questions like, how are your kids? How's your side job going?
Right.
And have a real relationship with them. And the goal is that at some point, if and when they decided that they wanted to get out of this life, they would know that they could come to us. I thought it was, for me, very striking that I would ask to pray for them and pray with them. And they would always, I think only one time did someone ever say no. They wanted that prayer. They wanted that connection.
Wow.
But then when we asked what we could pray for them about, it was always that they would be safe that night, which given that most of these individuals probably didn't see themselves as trafficking victims because of all the reasons I just mentioned, they probably thought of themselves as doing this of their own, choice. This was just how they were trying to make a living. And yet they still felt this very real fear every single night. We also, with a different group, one time I participated in a law enforcement sting where undercover officers go to the hotels, they pose as buyers, and then they will arrest the sex workers. And then what I was doing with the organization I was with is that we would meet with anybody who wanted to, any of the arrestees who wanted to, in a little tiny trailer, and we would give them, point them to some resources if they wanted help. And that was very interesting because for the most part, again, we would be trying to say, hey, are you okay? Are you doing this of your own free will? And only one of them was straight up enough to tell us, no, actually, there's this guy, he's abusing me, he's controlling me, here's his name. The rest all insisted that this was what they wanted to do. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. That approach in general is a very blunt instrument. The sting and then talking to people in a trailer is not really my preferred approach, but it was very illuminating to see across the board how many of them flatly denied that they were in any kind of bad situation. Although, to be fair, they also probably felt more defensive again than the ones that we're talking to on the street because they had been arrested.
True, but the fact that these people wanted you to pray for them and were realizing after seeing you several times that you cared about them, that's the way to go, because forming that trust would be a step towards them getting out of trafficking, that they can trust someone.
Yeah, that's why the contrast between those two approaches of working with the law enforcement sting versus walking on the streets was, to me, very, very stark, I guess, and very humbling.
Yeah.
I also want to mention, if there's time, that the other main way that I got involved with trafficking and working with individuals who'd survived it was with my church there, where they had a program for teenage survivors of human trafficking.
Wow.
So we're talking girls 11 to 18 they'd been arrested too. They'd been cycled through the justice system, most of them multiple times already. And they'd finally hit a point where they were willing to come voluntarily be part of a program that my church offered, where they did online classes, they had counseling, they had a safe house where they could stay. And initially my job was just to come keep them on track with schoolwork. But one girl needed a math tutor. No one else volunteered. So I volunteered. And that was incredible because I got to work with her very closely. And I remember the moment. And again, we're talking about a girl who at this point, she was 15 years old and she'd already lived through the unthinkable. And I was there in the moment where she realized, oh, I can do something with my life other than being a prostitute. And she started having dreams about science and things like that. And it was absolutely incredible to watch that.
That's really neat. So because of a lot of this, you created a bill while you were in Las Vegas. And that's just amazing. You were so young, and it was passed in Nevada legislature. So why don't you share about your journey from creating this bill and what it said?
Yeah, so this is, to me, such a clear example of God and his goodness, because I did not think much of this at the time. My friends, so fellow law school classmates, they designed a competition where all of us created a bill, presented it to some judges, and it was just an in law school competition, which I've done different kinds of those, and they're great in law school, but they don't impact the real world necessarily. But one of the judges of this competition is an Assemblywoman Hardy in Nevada. And she judged my presentation when I wrote a bill that I wrote it because it was based on the research I'd already done. And it was something that I figured no one would say no to, which was to eliminate the statute of limitations for sex trafficking, which at the time in Las Vegas was only 4 years. Meaning that someone, by the time that they finally escape this abuse and they escape the control of their trafficker, they now have a total of 4 years to heal from all of that trauma. Enough to go talk to law enforcement, who again are probably kind of scary to them, even more so than to the rest of us, who are any of us would not want to tell complete strangers this kind of these intimate details of our lives. But certainly a trafficking victim would not feel comfortable talking to cops about their criminal activities, which usually went along with trafficking. But so yeah, they had 4 years under the law to be able to heal enough to do that, to go report the crime. Yeah. And I thought that's terrible. So let's eliminate that statute of limitations. There's already so much research on how even for a single sexual assault, it can take someone 20 years to come forward. And trafficking is by definition repeated sexual assaults. So we needed more time. So I wrote the bill. And when I presented it, didn't think much of it. I think I got to the semifinals in the competition and kind of moved on. But then this Assemblywoman reached out to me a couple months later and said, hey, I want to sponsor your bill for real. Oh. I was like, awesome. Are you joking? So we spent the next couple months putting together the presentation, presented it to the assembly, everyone else jumped in and wanted to sponsor as well. So then we presented it to the entire legislature, and now it's law. It was shrunk in a sense for political reasons to now extend the statute of limitations to 6 years rather than eliminating it entirely. But I think that's still a great step. It put this problem on radar. So
because 4 years, things are so fresh still, and they might not even have, you wouldn't have gotten to really work through it. 6 years is definitely better. 8 or 10 would have been better. But you know, it definitely is a step in the right direction. And kudos to that assemblywoman who saw your vision and wanted to.
And she has since done a lot more research into trafficking on her own, and kind of built her own coalition almost of people who are telling her more about it and working with her on other projects. So it's very exciting. It feels like the small kind of pebbles that, would precede an avalanche.
Yeah. Now that you're, no longer living in Nevada and you're living in Idaho and you're working kind of a normal law school job, being a deputy prosecutor, which I don't know exactly what that is, but what's your ultimate goal? How long are you thinking you might do something like that, or how are you going to get back into being involved with human trafficking?
Right. So I am very young, and so I now have been prosecuting in my first actual attorney job for a grand total of 10 months. That means that right now I'm prosecuting misdemeanors and still working my way kind of up the food chain, so to speak, at the office, in the district attorney's office here in the county of Twin Falls. The goal for me, at least here in Twin Falls, where I do think there is quite a bit of need, and really in Idaho in general, the goal is to prosecute sex crimes generally, and then identify sex trafficking wherever I can. But I also want to keep my eyes open for opportunities to build more programming and kind of combine resources, because there are a lot of people across Idaho who, some of whom are passionate about trafficking specifically, others of whom are very passionate about adjacent issues like homelessness, foster care, just providing safe adults for kids in general. All of that helps fight abuse of all sorts, including trafficking. And so I would love to unify a lot of these groups and share resources and collaborate. I don't know exactly what that vision looks like, but that's something that's kind of my heart now. If I go back to Las Vegas one day, which is also my dream, then I would love to be part of the team that prosecutes sex trafficking there specifically. But I think for now, God has me here. So I'm trying to trust his plan wherever I end up.
Well, that will grow you. Like you say, you're pretty young and you want to have some credibility. Those of us who know you a little better, we know that you're going to make things happen. And it's been exciting for me to see this process of however many years, law school, and before that, like the last 6 years, 7 years of you working on this. It's been great. So you don't have any sort of timeline for how long that would take, right?
Right. So one of the advantages to being a deputy prosecuting attorney here in Twin Falls, I'm going to give a shout out to my boss, Grant Lobes. He is a very ethical prosecutor and runs the office with a lot of ethics, and not all prosecutors and not all DAs do that. This can be a very political role. So it's just a stepping stone to being a judge, to being a congressman, to being something else. And so what I told them when they hired me, when I was interviewing, actually, was, hey, I would love to be here for maybe 5 years, learn how to prosecute ethically, and get this experience under my belt. So I have the confidence, if I go somewhere else, to really stand my ground and say, hey, no, I know how to do these crimes right, and not cut corners or go the political routes. And so I think building my experience and credibility here in Twin Falls will give me a really good ability to then potentially go somewhere else where maybe there's not quite the same focus on ethics. And so in my head, 5 years is kind of the timeline. But again, I'm trying to hold that very loosely because I've learned that God knows better.
Yeah. And so I guess thinking of your journey, and what would be some things that you wish that people knew more about sex crimes and ways that people could help? Just
That is
the basic person.
Right. I think one thing that I wish more people knew is how many, what some of the red flags look like. And I remember I did speak about this a little bit when I presented at our church about my thesis about some of the signs of trauma that can be misinterpreted as just evidence of bad behavior. And so, for example, with young girls, if they start taking very risky behaviors, including, not limited to, but including dressing very provocatively and suddenly becoming very promiscuous, that can be part of them trying to essentially control a part of their lives that has been taken from them. So if you have someone who's experienced sexual abuse where they don't have any control over their body, then now they say, oh, okay, I'm going to control this now. And then they go out and they make very risky choices as a way to kind of prove to themselves that this part of their lives is under control again. And from the outside, that can look like rebellion. It can look like just teenage foolishness. It can look like immorality. And I wish that people would just be more thoughtful, quicker to listen, quicker to ask questions, quicker to care about the person beneath the decisions. Not that every time someone starts making those choices means that they're being abused, but it is a correlation. And so I wish that more people looked for that and showed love and offered help rather than just trying to correct a behavior, because there's probably something underneath that.
You know, you made a brief comment about the foster system in another answer. Do you find that there's people within the foster system that just really struggle with acceptance and finding a way out or finding love?
Yes, when you're in the foster system as a child, then your entire life is very transitory. There's not stability there. You have been told that at any given moment, the people who are supposed to love you and provide safety for you, they might change their minds. You might be too difficult for them. And so you have to see yourself through this lens of, I'm unwanted, but how can I make people want me? And so accepting real love, trusting real love is very difficult. And that's even when the foster families are really doing their best. And sometimes they just get maxed out. There aren't enough resources for them. And then in other situations, you have outright neglect and you have abuse. All the girls that we worked with in Las Vegas had been through the foster care system in one way or another. And so at best, the signs of abuse were missed. And at worst, it was actively part of their lives in the foster care system.
So they don't trust anybody.
No.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
That's, trying to get their mind so they can, really believe someone cares for them and that they don't have to resort to difficult things in their life is, a tough thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gabrielle, I really appreciate you coming and sharing with us about all these details. And truthfully, I kind of wish people just watch this podcast over and over to get it in their head what really the details are, and Gabby and I are actually working on a movie idea that deals with human trafficking. So I've met with her about this to bring awareness, and we'll see if that ever happens. But I am very much looking forward to working with you again, and so thankful for you and all the work that you've done. And I hope that all of you, that's given you some insights on the widespread issue that this is in our country and other countries too. And so you can, just keep this in your mind on maybe things that you could do also that would help this. So I will see you next time on Live Boldly Ministries podcast. And you can find this on my website at NickiCorinneWhite.com, or you can email me, NickiCorinneWhite@gmail, and send me a message, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much. God bless.